On Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. We're spending the hour with Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is the award-winning national correspondent for The Atlantic magazine. His new book is called Between the World and Me. And Ta-Nehisi, if you would read a section of this book.
Sure. And this is towards the end of my interview with Mable Jones, and she is trying to describe the impact of Prince's death on her life and just on how she sees the world. Prince had a sister, and so, I asked her about this, and she, went here. I now wondered about her daughter, who'd been recently married. There was a picture on display of this daughter and her new husband. Dr. Jones was not optimistic. She was intensely worried about her daughter bringing her son into America because she could not save him. She could not secure his body from the ritual violence that had claimed her son. She compared America to Rome. She said she thought the glory days of this country had long passed, and even those glory days were sullied. They had been built on the bodies of others. And we can't get the message, she said. We don't understand that we are embracing our deaths. I asked Dr. Jones if her mother was still alive. She told me her mother had passed away in 2002 at the age of 89. I asked Dr. Jones how her mother had taken Prince's death, and her voice retreated into an almost whisper, and Dr. Jones said, I don't know that she did. She alluded to 12 years a slave. There he was, she said, speaking of Solomon Northrop. He had means, he had a family, he was living like a human being, and one racist act took him back. And the same is true of me. I spent years developing a career, acquiring assets, engaging responsibilities, and one racist act. It's all it takes.
That's Ta-Nehisi Coates reading from his book, Between the World and Me.
I wanted to ask you, you say in the book, when you were delving through all the scores of volumes in Howard University, that you discovered that knowledge is not accumulated through consensus and through adding by one scholar to another to the trove of knowledge, but that there's constant conflict and debate, and there are political sects and different analyses and perspectives on the same issue. So I wanted to ask you about the criticism, some of the criticism of it that's been raised of your book by another great intellectual here in this country, Cornel West, who wrote in defense of James Baldwin why Toni Morrison, a literary genius, is wrong about Ta-Nehisi Coates. And Cornell writes, Baldwin was a great writer of profound courage who spoke truth to power. Coates is a clever wordsmith with journalistic talent who avoids any critique of the black president in power. I'm wondering, of course, that spawned in itself another attack on Cornel West by Michael Eric Dyson in defense of you. So you've now your book has now become part of the ongoing debate between African-American intellectuals in this country. Your response to Cornel West?
Well, I was really, really sorry to see that. One of my memories at Howard University is seeing Cornel West come there actually with Henry Louis Gates, and face Howard. They had come down from Harvard, and we at Howard kind of looked at Harvard a little askance, and really just take on the really, really challenging questions from the audience and from the students there. It was deeply, deeply inspirational. It was one of those experiences that I could only receive at Howard University. I don't think Cornel West knows who I am, and I don't mean like I'm all that and he doesn't know who I am. I mean, I literally don't. I think he saw this James Baldwin quote and from Toni Morrison, and I think he then went and wrote a couple of Facebook posts. I wrote a book. People can read my book. I hope they do, and they can read his Facebook posts, and they can decide whether which has more merit. People can read Cornel West's claim that I avoid any critique of the president. Or they can go to The Atlantic and see what I've actually written about the president. And then they can decide which is true. I have great, great admiration for Cornel West. I think he's, made a weighty contribution, to black literature and to black letters. I hope he continues to do that.
Ta-Nehisi, you actually met with President Obama twice.
I did.
Can you talk about these meetings, how you prepared for them, what you said to him? When was it?
Well, one of them was interesting that you asked that after that question. The first one was after I, levied quite a bit of critique of his Morehouse speech, which I was not a fan of and am not a fan of now. I think that the president, I thought then and I think now, that the president has a tendency when it's convenient, for him to emphasize that he is, the president of all America. And then when it comes to issues of morality, to deliver a message that the president of all America has no right to deliver. The president of all America, the bearer of the heritage of America, the bearer of policy, of America, which has, for the vast, vast majority of its history, has been a policy of plunder towards black people, has no right to lecture black people on morality. That's my position. I understand, an African-American man wanting to have a conversation with young people, but as the president of America, as far as I'm concerned, you give up that right. If there cannot be, direct policy towards black people, then there should be no direct criticism towards black people either. Having said that, I wrote the piece, and probably within a day, I got a call to, come to the White House. I was not sure why they didn't say, what, it was about, and I was there with a bunch of other reporters, and I asked him a question that was semi-related, and he sort of answered and then, immediately launched into an attack on my piece. And I left that meeting quite disappointed. Not disappointed in him, he did what I expected him to do, but disappointed in myself. I felt that I had not, been particularly challenging. I have to tell you, you sit in a room, it's the president of the United States. It's the guy, with the launch clothes, and he's, just an extremely intelligent person. I had watched him, joust and answer all of these questions, and, it takes some amount of courage. I mean, those are the facts. The second time I probably was a little bit more challenging.
What did your wife tell you on the way to your second trip?
Guys, my wife said, "What would James Baldwin do?" And she was recounting, actually she was not just, that she was recounting the encounter he had with John F. Kennedy. That's what she was thinking about. It wasn't just a sort of blithe, what would James Baldwin. She was recounting, how James Baldwin had gave Kennedy hell, She said, what would he do? And I arrived to this meeting. All the other journalists were in suits. I was not in a suit. I was in jeans. I was late. I had been rained on. It was not, proprietary circumstances. But, even in that meeting, I was deeply concerned about, the liberal and the progressive notion that one should pursue policy based on class and not really, deal with race. And I was concerned that as the ACA was playing out, as Obamacare, as they call it, was playing out. In fact, there were whole swaths of people in the southern, states who were being left out. And, a majority of those people were black people. And this is a tradition with class-based policy that goes all the way back to the New Deal. So I thought it was very, very important, to try to directly, challenge as much as possible. You're not going to beat the president. You just, in that situation, you're just not. But as much as possible to raise questions about it.
And your reaction in recent weeks to the president's finally addressing issues like mass incarceration in a real way in this country?
Well, I think it's good. I think it's a good thing. I do, bear some amount, of sympathy towards the president from this perspective. The president of the United States is not a king. Barack Obama was elected, by the American people. And in fact, the basis for my sympathy is the basis of my criticism. In fact, that if you're president of you have no right to do certain things, and at the same time, you're limited, in terms of what you can do because you basically serve at their pleasure. I think it's good. I think that one should not, and this is beyond the president, but I think one should not be lured into a false sense of the ease, with which one will dismantle the carceral state. Our current population, in our jails and prisons is roughly 10 times what it was in 1970. The sociologist Diva Paja estimates that every year, enough people are released from our jails and prisons to fill every fast food job in this country, something like 10 times over. We have a huge, huge job ahead of us, and I think any sort of presidential rhetoric in that direction and action is good, but this is going to take a long time.
I want to ask you about another of the responses to your book. It's New York Times columnist David Brooks,
the kinder, gentler conservative,
who wrote in a letter addressed to you, quote, "I think you distort American history. This country, like each person in it, is a mixture of glory and shame. There's a Lincoln for every Jefferson Davis and a Harlem's Children's Zone for every KKK, and usually vastly more than one. Violence is embedded in America, but it's not close to the totality of America. Those are the words of David Brooks of the New York Times.
Well, I would just challenge that on the facts. There is not an Abraham Lincoln for every Jefferson Davis. As the great historian Ed Baptiste responded, wrong. Every president up to Abraham Lincoln was Jefferson Davis. It simply is. That's not a. I mean, that's just like factual. Abraham Lincoln is singular. Abraham Lincoln, before he was killed, stood up and, for the first time, from any sitting president, stood for the right for suffrage for African-American men who had served in the Civil War. And that's a limited suffrage, but it was quite radical at the time. It is rumored that John Wilkes Booth was there, heard that, said, by God, that means nigger equality, I'll run him through, and then shot Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was killed by the forces of white supremacy. He stands out as unique. There's no other president like that. What Jefferson Davis did, the idea that somehow holding people in slavery was an essential part of America is a very, very old belief. I mean, he's a white supremacist. White supremacy is a very, very popular and entrenched belief in this country's history and heritage. So those two things are just not equivalent. The Ku Klux Klan is not the opposite of the Harlem Children's Zone. The Ku Klux Klan is the most profligate domestic terrorist organization, in this country's history. The Harlem Children's Zone is an organization just based in Harlem that's doing good work, but that there's not enough of across this country. The Ku Klux Klan was a national terrorist organization. It is not an answer. One is not the answer for the other.
I wanted to ask you about your critique of the education system in America. You're very, very strong in your book on the failures of classroom teaching, and basically that you got most of your knowledge yourself in a library. Yeah. Could you talk about that?
Well, and this is like one area, like if you think about like further research, like I would like to, I was talking how the case for reparations was empiricism first, and this is personal. This is personal, and then I want to go out and hopefully test the empiricism. What I can talk about is my direct experience. It just, I had no idea why I was in school. And what I use all the time is I think about like the French language, and I think about how in 7th grade I was in a French class. And essentially what I was given was a list of words to memorize each day that meant, and this determined how successful you were in your French class. But I had no notion of how one would actually utilize French. I understood that France was some other place on the other side of the world, but it was effectively an abstraction. No one I knew spoke French. French was not useful to me. I had no notion. And so, with no investment, with nothing at stake, as far as I could see directly, I, cut up and, acted a fool in that class. Lo and behold, here I am, some 25 years later, and you can see that the world is quite big. That in fact, language is actually, any language is actually really, really important, that it allows you to see more, that it allows you to bear witness. I have a young son, who I wrote to, my only son, who I wrote this to, who is very, very passionate, about the French language. At the same age, I was, completely dispassionate, totally anti. Well, he's been raised in a world where he can see a language can actually take you places. He knows, people who actually speak French. He's seen other things, and so for him, it's very, very tangible. It's not an abstraction for him, and so much of the things I was angled towards in school, they were abstract. I could not figure out how they actually would improve me or do anything for me, and so that was a source of great, great frustration for me.
You're moving to Paris.
I am, yeah, in 3 weeks.
You, your wife, and your son?
Yes, in 3 weeks, and he's going to go to school over there.
James Baldwin lived in France. He died in France.
He did, yes. And, it's one of that, no one will believe me on this, but that portion is actually purely coincidental. Or maybe not, I mean, maybe there's something, about the country that attracts, African Americans of a particular creative persuasion. What I can tell you is I never perceived myself as walking in his footsteps. In that aspect, certainly, he's probably the biggest influence, on me from a literary perspective, but that, really comes from my wife, who, had all of this. She had this long romance with Paris from the time she was a child.
You met at Howard?
We did meet at Howard, yes. We met at Howard, went for her 30th birthday, fell in love, told me that I must go, and I would fall in love. The same thing happened, and, here we are.
I wanted to go to this issue of race and class and what's happened just over the weekend in presidential politics. This weekend, members of the Black Lives Matter movement staged a protest inside Netroots Nation conference in Phoenix by repeatedly interrupting Democratic presidential candidates Senator Bernie Sanders and former Maryland Governor Martin O'Malley. Members of the Black Lives Matter movement interrupted O'Malley's portion of the event and took to the stage.
Let me be clear. Every single day are dying. Not being able to take another breath. We are in a state of emergency. We are in a state of emergency. And if you don't feel that emergency, you are not human.
After the interruption, Governor Martin O'Malley responded by saying Black Lives Matter, White Lives Matter, all lives matter. He later apologized for the comments. Senator Sanders threatened to leave the stage after protesters repeatedly interrupted his remarks. If you could respond to both, and of course, Martin O'Malley is, is from where you're from, right? He was the mayor of Baltimore. He was the governor of Maryland.
Mm-hmm. It's very, very hard for me to respond to the protests because, and this is, the God's honest truth, I have been absorbed with, trying to keep up with this book. So that's actually my first time seeing the protest. I saw something a little bit about it on Twitter, but I actually don't have, like the full knowledge of what, the intent of the protest, was or what people were trying to accomplish. I will say that, part of protest is making people uncomfortable. Part of protest is being annoying. And I'll also say that I'm quite familiar with Martin O'Malley's record in terms of criminal justice, just going back to this question of incarceration. And I think even beyond protest, there's some very, very direct questions, especially in this era that we find ourselves in right now, that should be posed to him. Particularly about, what happened in terms of parole and probation in Maryland during the course of time in which he was governor. He had a very, very active role in that. It's hard for me to respond to the protest just because I don't have enough information right now.
Mm-hmm. Let's turn to the man you've been compared to, James Baldwin. Let's turn to his book, The Fire Next Time, dealing with issues of Black identity in the state of racial struggle. In this speech, he speaks in '63 in Oakland, California's Castlemont High School.
I think the other reason, and perhaps the most important reason, that I'm throwing the suggestions out to you tonight, is that in this country, every black man born in this country until this present moment is born into a country which assures him in as many ways as it can find that he is not worth the dirt he walks on. Every Negro boy and every Negro girl born in this country until this present moment undergoes the agony of trying to find in the body politic, in the body social, outside himself, herself, some image of himself or herself which is not demeaning. Now many, indeed, have survived and at an incalculable cost, and many more have perished and are perishing every day. If you tell a child and do your best to prove to the child that he is not worth life, it is entirely possible that sooner or later the child begins to believe it.
That's James Baldwin speaking in June of 1963, that audio from the Pacifica Radio Archives. In this last minute we have with you, Ta-Nehisi Coates, where have we come in more than half a century?
I think there's been some progress. I think if people like me appear impatient, it is with the fact that, we are talking about a system that has basically been in place since 1619. Progress is good, but until, we live in a country in which white supremacy has been banished, until we live in a country where one can look at, prisons if we are to have them and not see an 8-to-1 ratio, until we can, look at a country and not, see black men comprising roughly 8% of the world's, imprisoned population, until, we can, have a situation in which, I can turn on the news or come on this show and be able to discuss other things besides, Sandra Bland being threatened with being, to light her up, as he said, over a turn signal, until we have a situation in which Tamir Rice, who's out playing, is not, effectively committing a lethal crime, a crime that threatens his life, until we have a situation where, Kajieme Powell, for mere fact of being mentally ill, is not shot down in the street, until we have, a situation in which, John Crawford, who is shopping in Wal-Mart, is not shot down and executed in a store. Progress is nice, but it's, to be noted, and the struggle continues after that.
Ta-Nehisi Coates, we thank you so much for being with us. National correspondent for The Atlantic. His book is called Between the World and Me. That does it for our broadcast. If you'd like a copy of the show, you can go to democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Nermeen Sheikh, Steve Martinez, Sam Alcoff, Hani Massoud, Robbie Karen, Laura Gottesdiener, Dina Guzder, Amy Littlefield, Juan Carlos Davila, Pedro Rodriguez. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.